And we have a distinguished guest in the studio with us. He is the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. Justice Mark Martin has joined us live this morning. He is making a swing through the East for a day or two, and we were fortunate enough to snag him here and get him in the studio to talk to us a little bit. Good morning, Justice Martin. How are you?
Good morning, Henry. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Good to be back in Greenville.
Yeah, and you know we should talk about being back in Greenville because is it true that you actually started your career as a judge in Greenville, North Carolina?
I did, and what an honor. Lived right off Greenville Boulevard and worked right at the courthouse here from 1992 to 1994. And just incredible memories.
Yeah. So where are you from originally?
Well, my father was in the Air Force, so we moved around a good bit, but ultimately settled in the western part of the state. He passed away in 1990, but he was a professor at Western Carolina University.
Interesting. I just spent 3 days out at Western Carolina.
Oh, were you there for the Board of Governors meeting?
I was. A lot of good stuff going on over there.
Wow. Yeah. Very big, anniversary up there this
year. Yeah, they're doing a nice job over there at Western Carolina, and the chancellor over there is doing a terrific job, David Belcher. I don't know if you've met him. Like him a lot. All right, so I know that you're serving. How many? Is this your first or second? I mean, how many terms have you been on the Supreme Court?
Well, the judicial terms for the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and Superior Court are the longest terms of office that we have in North Carolina. They're 8-year terms. So I'm completing my second term, but that means 16 years. So at the end of this year, I will have served on the Supreme Court for 16 years.
And I know the governor just appointed you as Chief Justice because the Chief Justice, Sarah Parker, is retiring. Or did she step down?
Well, normally she would have served till the end of the year and completed her term of office, but we have a retirement statute for judges, and the month in which you turn 72, you have to retire at the end of the month. So Chief Justice Parker retired at the end of August.
Okay. And it's now under normal circumstances, do you have to run for Chief Justice, which is what you're doing now? You're up for re-election in November.
Right. Well,
and the voters determine who the Chief Justice is.
Absolutely. We elect judges in North Carolina, and this is right in the state constitution in our founding documents. And the voters will select who they would like to see as their Chief Justice, and it'll be for an 8-year term. So it's an important election for the court. There's also a role for a governor. And the governor followed tradition and appointed the justice with the most seniority. Remember, the Chief Justice leads the Supreme Court. So typically the Chief Justice is the individual with the most seniority on the court, most knowledgeable about the institutional customs and practices of the court, most of which are largely unwritten. And then the voters have a role after an interim person is appointed to make the determination for a full term.
You know, I think the average person doesn't really understand how the judicial system works in North Carolina. So if you don't mind, let's kind of talk about that a little bit. There's a Court of Appeals, and then, of course, what's the court below that? Kind of take us through if someone is going to appeal something, where it starts and where it ends up.
Well, let me kind of give you the 2-minute version because I think it sets it out in a way that can be helpful. We have 2 courts where those courts are devoted to trying to find out what happened in a situation, trying to determine what are the facts, and then the judges are able to apply the law once they determine the facts. Our first court for discussion is the district court, and this is the court that most North Carolinians have interacted with at some point or another. If you have a speeding ticket, you'll go to the district court. Misdemeanors, other less serious offenses will be in the district court. The district court handles juvenile law situations as well as domestic law. Most of what happens in the district court, the judge himself or herself determines what factually happened. Then we have the Superior Court, and the Superior Court handles more serious crimes and civil actions involving more money. The key on both of these courts is that these courts operate in our county courthouses, and these are typically the courts that people come into contact with. These judges spend a lot of time in the courtroom and handle a huge volume of cases. A totally separate court is known as an appellate court. Both of these courts are in Raleigh, and they hear appeals from all over the state. And you basically just have two levels of appellate court. The Court of Appeals was opened in the 1960s because the volume of appeals was so high. And this court is known as our first level of appellate review to ensure that everybody has at least one bite at appellate review. And our Supreme Court is designed to hear fewer appeals, but to make sure it's hearing cases that are of significant public interest, importance to our law, and also situations where a lower court judge has issued an opinion that is not consistent with the case law.
The argument goes on about how judges become judges at these high court levels, at the Court of Appeals and also at the Supreme Court. And we elect our judges in North Carolina. Do other states have appointed Supreme Court justices?
Well, let me give you the 50-state survey quickly, because I think it's interesting. 22 states have direct election of high court judges or justices, whatever they call them in a particular state. And so that's almost half. Then you have another 16 states that use a merit selection type plan, where you have a screening panel composed of attorneys and citizens, and the details vary, but they make recommendations to a governor who normally would pick from among the nominees proposed by the screening commission. The final 12 states either have some sort of life tenure or just a less common system. For instance, South Carolina, the legislature elects the judges for the Supreme Court and Court of Appeals. So you have a lot of different systems. My view on this is that let's make the system work that we have. And to make the elective system work, we have to make sure that people have the information they need to feel comfortable making an informed decision when they go to the polls.
So you like the maybe like is too strong a word. You are happy with, and you think that this is the best system to have citizens go to the polls and elect the judges.
Well, I believe that whatever system you use, it's all going to come down to the details, the finer points. You can make an elective system work. If we as voters do not take our obligations seriously and learn about the candidates, then that creates a situation where you can make an argument that perhaps we ought to be looking at other ways of doing it. I have been elected by the people of North Carolina 3 times, 1994, 1998, 2006. On each of these occasions, I was very impressed with when voter guides were sent out. I would go to my poll and see every 6 or 7 people carrying that voter guide. So I think people are really want to make good decisions when they vote for the judges, but it's also a daunting challenge. I mean, this election cycle alone, we have 4 out of 7 Supreme Court seats up, and these individuals will serve for 8-year terms. So it's a really critical election cycle for our Supreme Court. We also have 4 seats on the Court of Appeals, out of a court of 15 judges. So it's a very important election, and from one voter to the others, I would respectfully ask folks to take a careful look at these races, because we want to make sure we have the best qualified people, particularly in light of the fact that they'll serve for such lengthy terms.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I always worry about the judicial elections because, you know, I don't. You can be informed and, you know, go into the polls sometimes and get a little bit of a surprise. Well, I didn't know I had to vote for that. And then all of a sudden you're kind of stuck with having to make a decision. You're in the polls already. If you haven't done your homework, I say don't vote. But I think people do. And there have been surveys that show that people actually go in and make decisions on who's on the top line, or if is it a female or whatever, and then, you know, that worries me a lot. I mean, it just concerns me that that's the system, but that's what we're faced with in North Carolina in voting for judges, and sometimes in other elections as well, but really with judges.
Well, I understand your point, and I think we have time, though, to for people to learn about these elections between now and the start of early voting, and then on Election Day on November 4. But I think the key when it comes to judges, to make sure we have people with the requisite qualifications and experience. And we use these terms demeanor and temperament, but what it really means is a judge's ability not to prejudge a situation, but to listen carefully to both sides before you come to a decision. And finally, particularly for someone who would serve on the Supreme Court, we need demonstrated integrity in those individuals. Unlike our General Assembly, where we have committee hearings and members of the public are able to come in and give input, because of the nature of the adversarial process to ensure fairness to both sides, the judges deliberate as a group, and it's not open to people to come into the court and be a part of that conversation. So we really need to make sure we have people of demonstrated integrity.
Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in North Carolina, Mark Martin, our guest live in the studio this morning. Who decides what goes to the Supreme Court?
Well, it's an excellent question, and because the Supreme Court is the second level of appellate review, the justices themselves have a good deal to say about which cases come to the court, as well as the legislative branch. It's a combination. And in those situations where the legislature requires us to hear cases, that is known as mandatory appellate jurisdiction, and the rest of our docket is known as discretionary appellate jurisdiction, where parties will bring petitions to us seeking to have full briefing and argument in their cases, and we have to select from among that pool to hear cases. And so we have two sources of cases, generally speaking, and then we have sessions of oral argument every month. But unlike the trial court judges, because I have served on the trial court like my opponent in this election, but I've also served on the appellate courts for 20 years, and it's a much different role. You spend less time in the courtroom. You have a lot more time reading briefs, which are just the written documents prepared by counsel for the parties, the record on appeal, which includes a transcript of proceedings, and then we spend a lot of our time actually drafting decisions. So it's a very, for lack of a better term, a very academic role.
If somebody doesn't like the decision made by the Supreme Court in North Carolina, do they have a recourse? Is that one that might go to the federal courts, or is it over once you folks make a decision?
Well, yes and no. The state Supreme Court is the final stop for state law questions and non-federal questions. If your case actually includes a federal constitutional or statutory question, in other words, United States law, then you can at least try to petition the U.S. Supreme Court for review. Now, that's a very challenging proposition because the U.S. Supreme Court hears about 80 fully briefed and argued cases a year, and that's from all 50 states plus all of the lower federal courts. But on a state law question, let's assume that the question involves a statute, and there's a real consensus within the state that the court made a mistake. Well, the General Assembly can go and amend that law and lead to a different outcome moving forward. Mm-hmm. Now, if it is a holding under the state constitution, that would be a final holding until and unless the court revised that in a later holding, or unless the Constitution were amended.
Chief Justice Mark Martin of the North Carolina Supreme Court, there's 7 of you on this court. Do you get along?
We do. There are 6.
Is there anybody you dislike? No, don't answer that.
No, I will answer it. There's nobody I dislike. You could understand when you have 7 people, varying life experiences, varying philosophies, and we understand collectively the importance of what we're doing. And we understand that we work for the people of North Carolina. And we understand that it's so important to get along on a personal level. So we really focus on collegiality. We really want to be role models to younger attorneys on issues such as professionalism. In other words, we can agree to disagree. We can have intense debate on how constitutional or statutory provisions will be construed, and at the same time get along. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, because I think in society we're necessarily going to have disagreements, but at the end of the day, we have to realize that what unites us as Americans and as North Carolinians is much greater than the things that could potentially divide.
You know, I assume that it's almost impossible to keep politics out of it, And I know you can't comment on specific issues. We talked about that, and I'm not going to ask you any. But, there's some big issues up coming at you. We've got the whole question of school choice in North Carolina. You got the question of voter ID and things like that. I guess it's just impossible to keep the politics out of it. But when the seven of you are faced with making a major decision about the future of the state and where we're going and things like that, how's the decision made? Do you discuss it? Do you get behind closed doors in a conference room and argue it out? How does that work?
Well, let me try to make 2 points. First of all, when you use the term politics, and I think about the legislature and the executive branch, here I think it's a differing type of political discourse. Many times it's about competing policy choices, differing political preferences. Not the same with judges. When you say, yes, judges could have different opinions, normally that is grounded in different views of the Constitution, different views of the law, perhaps differing legal philosophies. But I have rarely seen in my 22 years as a judge just operating in a political manner like you would see in the legislature. And I feel that would be inappropriate. I think our judges need to do everything they can to minimize any political influences in our courts. Because remember, this is the final stop to ensure that the rights and responsibilities of our citizens are given a fair and impartial forum. And I think that's why we have to affirmatively work to minimize political influences in the courts. We know in what I would call the political branches, the legislative branch, the executive branch, we want our candidates to bring us a political platform. And we hope on a good day that they will go to Raleigh and stay true to what they promised us. With judges, we should only promise the fair and impartial performance of our duties. And in that way, if I staked myself out on the tough issues of the day, just imagine if you were the litigant on the losing side ahead of time, having heard me on the campaign trail make a decision on that issue.
Right.
Would you really feel like you were getting fair justice?
Which is why you can't talk about any of those issues, right?
Right. And if we really want our courts to be fundamentally fair to everyone, that's the policy we have to have.
Right.
Now, some candidates will push the envelope a little bit farther, but I believe that many times that's designed just to help them get elected. And I'm very interested about the court system we have after all the elections have come and gone.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I believe I heard last night you're the only, help me with this, Charles Ellis is sitting over, Charles said this last night, the only justice that has court experience, district court, trial as a trial lawyer,
Superior
on
Court.
the Superior Court, Court of Appeals.
Right.
Because you were on the Court of Appeals
Right.
and the Supreme Court.
Right.
Are you still the only person on the Supreme Court that has all those qualifications?
Yes, and I think it's helpful for your viewers to know this morning that of the two candidates in the election for Chief Justice, I've been on the Supreme Court nearly 16 years. I say this respectfully. My opponent has never served on the Supreme Court. I'm the only candidate that's actually done what a Supreme Court justice does, and that is draft appellate decisions. And remember, the Chief Justice leads the Supreme Court. So whether you're running a company or a nonprofit or any other type of institution, you really need experience running that company or one that is comparable in order to learn how to run the company. And how can others follow your leadership if you're not knowledgeable in how the institution works? And that's the same with the Supreme Court. And that's why in our entire history as a state, we've never had a person elected as Chief Justice who did not first serve on the court.
Interesting. All right. Well, it's fascinating to learn more about you and the Supreme Court and how the system works. And it's been nice getting to know you. Appreciate you spending some time in Greenville this week.
Well, it's been my honor, and it's been particularly fun to be back in Greenville and to see so many friends. And
You do have a lot of friends here, don't you?
Well, it's
on both sides of the aisle, I might add. I've never seen a candidate get support from everybody before, but you seem to be that way.
Well, I think this election for a lot of people begins and ends at a basic qualification level. And so I'm honored to have that broad support for a role that's so critical to the operation of our judicial and legal system.
Yeah. Well, it's been an honor having you here. Appreciate you coming. Good
Well,
to see you.
thank you so much. Great to
Absolutely.
see you again.
Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court.